Good afternoon, everybody. It's gone 2 o'clock, so I'm going to start this meeting of the Audit Committee. The first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies?
Good afternoon. Yeah, apologies for absence from Councillors Clark and Watkins.
And I'd just like to go through those who are present at the meeting who are not councillors. So if I'm going to start on my far left, if you'd like to introduce yourselves for the live stream.
Good afternoon, Andrew Wathen, Chief Internal Auditor.
Peter Davis, Chief Officer for Resources.
And I'm Philip White. I'm the lay member of the committee and the chair.
Wendy Barnard, Democratic Services Officer.
So if you go over to you.
Jonathan Davis, Finance Manager.
Leslie Russell, Senior Accountant for Treasury.
Gareth Lucy, Financial Audit Manager with the Wales Audit Office.
And if we can just go on to Emma and Matthew on the back row.
Emma Davis, Performance Officer.
Matthew Gatehouse, Head of Policy and Governance.
Thank you very much for that. Declarations of interest, I'm happy to take them as we go through the agenda, unless anybody wants to speak out now. The public open forum is the next item on the agenda. I see no members of the public present, so I'll move on. Now we're going to look at the action list from the previous meeting. Now, I understand that, well, I know that Mr. Davis gave us a written report in response to the first item on performance management. He gave us the report on the 10th of January. Is there anything you wish to add to that?
Just in terms of, so sorry, just to be clear here, we're talking about the annual staff appraisal process, correct?
Yes,
the action, yes.
The item that you gave us a note about.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So I think as confirmed and as per the conversation at the last meeting, we're looking to bring a full report after our outturn report later in the year. So members of the committee should expect to receive that in May, June time.
Thank you very much. The next item under the action list is the self-evaluation questionnaire. Does Mr. Watson want to say anything at this time?
Thank you, Chairman. Just a reminder, really, please, to members. This is about good governance in terms of how you think the Audit Committee operates. I've only had 3 responses so far, so if I could just remind other members to fill it in and return it back to me, I'd be very grateful. Thanks very much.
Yes, Councillor.
A complete pain. Can I have a hard copy, please? Because I still do not access emails. That's gone on now since January the 3rd. So it would be nice if somebody helped me out.
Yes, I'd just like to give my backing really to filling in the questionnaire. I think it's important that the Audit Committee is able to have the skills and to be able to carry out its duties effectively, to especially in the area of good governance and risk management and so on. And to be able to do that, I think we need to demonstrate that we can do it. And I think the self-evaluation questionnaire is just one of the ways in which the committee can demonstrate its effectiveness. So I'd like you to give your support to that, please. Next item is the forward work plan. We have that on the agenda. We have a full forward work plan, which we'll come to. There's some printouts of the revised forward work plan on the front desk here, if you need to come and collect it. The next Audit Committee action is about unfavourable audit opinions. Now, as I take it from the minutes from last time, there was some concern in the committee about whether managers were giving a positive response to the recommendations that were being made by internal audit. So could I just hand that over to you, Mr. Watson, if you've got anything to say at this time?
Okay, thank you, Chairman. This is in relation to the internal audit work we undertook on agency work, and we reported that into Audit Committee previously. So the concern was around whether or not managers were actually taking this seriously and responding in accordance with our report. So we've had the majority of responses back from the HR side. We're just waiting for 1 or 2 to come back to us from the procurement manager. and then we can take that forward and we can finalise the report. If Chair, you're happy, once we've done that, I can circulate our action plan, which includes the management responses in, to members outside of the meeting. If unless members are happy with that, I can do that.
Are we going to have a future agenda item on that? Say at the next meeting?
Depends in terms of what members request. If they're not happy with the responses managers have given, and we could do. Generally, they've agreed with our recommendations. It's just a matter of us going back and re-auditing that particular area to make sure they've implemented what they said they were going to implement. But I'm quite happy to have that discussion next time round.
I think there was some concern expressed in committee as to whether the actions were likely to be taken following the internal audit. And I think what I would like for us to be able to do is look at your report on what the managers' responses were, and then the committee can decide whether they want to talk to any of those individual managers about those issues. So if we could have it as an agenda item, then I think we would be in a better position to make an appraisal. So could we do that, please?
We can sort that out, yeah, no problem. And in the meantime, once I've got that the full response back, I can then circulate that information to members, so it will be prior to the next meeting.
Right, thank you. Okay, the next agenda item is also about an unfavourable opinion, but this one is about the use of fuel cards. Now, I have invited Deborah Hill-Howells and Deborah Jackson to a future meeting of the Audit Committee. Deborah Hill-Howells couldn't make today, so I think she's now agreed to come to the next one. She's also suggested that we should invite Roger Hoggins, who was the head of service at the time that the fuel cards, at the time of the report about the fuel cards, or at least the period covered by the report, he was head of service. So we'll see what develops there, but I hope that we'll have a session about fuel cards in the next meeting. All right then. Next item on the agenda then is the internal audit progress report for Q3. So over to Mr. Wathen.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. This is one of the regular reports I bring to Audit Committee, so hopefully members will be familiar with the format. It's twofold. It's about the performance of the team, my team, and we'll run through some performance indicators as at the end of Q3, end of December, and also to give Audit Committee members assurance on the adequacy of the internal control environment, governance arrangements and risk management processes in place within the organisation based on the opinions that we actually give as part of our internal audit work. So the number of audit opinions we've actually issued is 16, which is significantly more than as at Q2. So we're progressing, and things do pick up in Q3 and Q4. So out of the 45 audit jobs which we've taken to draft stage as at the 31st of December, 16 have been opinion related, and there's a complete mix. So we have 1 substantial, 5 considerable assurance, 3 reasonable, and 7 limited assurances. And with regards to the limited, they are detailed in the appendix, which we'll come on to in a moment. But the detail of that will generally be picked up in my 6-month update report on unfavourable audit opinions, where I can give members more meat on the bone as to why we determined it was a limited opinion. So that is quite reassuring that we're working through the opinions, and there are a mix in terms of the range that we offer. We're still trying to finalise 1 or 2 pieces of work from 18-19, and we're looking to do that in Q4 this time round. What I could do is, if members could just refer to page 7 of your pack, which is Appendix 1. That gives a summary of the opinions which I've just talked through, along with the detail of which job we actually undertook and the relevant opinion. So as I said, range from substantial, considerable, reasonable and limited. In terms of not applicable, that's where we're giving audit advice, adding value to the way in which the organisation works, picking up any implementation of audit recommendations, and also doing non-opinion work such as National Fraud Initiative, local performance indicators, and the annual governance statement. And then moving on to the performance of the team, which is at page 12 of your pack, Appendix 3. There are 2 tables to compare a year-on-year comparison and also a quarter-by-quarter comparison. The bottom table is 1920, and the highlighted column is quarter 3, which is the relevant column we're talking about here. So the key performance indicator is how well we're doing against the plan. We've achieved 51% against a target of 50%, so we're right on track. Getting jobs done in time is an important indicator, but it's not as important as the first one. And we're hitting 60% against the 60% target. The next 2 indicators are timeliness of getting reports out to service managers. And you'll see that that's not as good as we've been in the past and not in line with our targets. And that's something that we will work on in terms of management within the internal audit team to try and address. Some of that is in relation to negotiations we have to have with service managers, where we are discussing the actual content of the report, where we're demonstrating we've got evidence, and further evidence comes to light as part of that discussion. So we are working on reducing that significantly and trying to get it within the targets, but we're very conscious of it as an audit management team. Reassuringly, the audit recommendations which we make are being accepted by managers, and we also offer service managers an opportunity to comment on how the audit went, how satisfied they are by the process. Were we professional? Did we give them the outcome that they expected? Did we add value to their service area? And that's reassuringly 100% in terms of the feedback we're getting. So I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Well, I'll just start off by reminding ourselves what the recommendations are, that the committee should note the audit opinions issued, and then the committee should note progress made by the section towards meeting the 2019-20 operational audit plan and the section's performance indicators at the 9-month stage of the financial year. So I'd just throw that open to questions and observations, please. Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Reference to P1920-34 and P1920-36, which is the passenger transport unit. Could you expand more on the reasons why the risk rating is high? I understand that there may be maintenance problems with the fleet.
Certainly, Chairman, this is an indication of where we think that particular section or system is in our audit planning process. It is subjective, but when we pull our plan together for 1920, which is at an early stage, we've got to determine which jobs we think are high, medium and low, and then we allocate the work accordingly. In terms of getting to that particular position, we need to take into account our cumulative audit knowledge of that particular area, any known issues, any particular changes in management or systems, and that determines whether it's a high, medium or low risk at the beginning of the year in our audit plan.
Does that answer your query, Councillor Easton?
Sort of. You're giving advice on one side to the passenger transport unit, yet you've got to look at high risk on the other, which is 34 and 36. You're not really saying what the concerns you're obviously picking something up that isn't ticking over properly within the passenger transport unit, and is that affecting the business side of the passenger transport unit in terms of what you need to bring in to cover your mechanical problems, if I put it that way?
Okay, Chair. The risk assessment is what we do in the planning process. The opinion is what we do as part of the audit process. So for your second part of your question, it's about issues we've identified during the course of our audit, where we've identified that the weaknesses outweigh the strengths and therefore it's had a limited opinion. In terms of giving advice, we give advice in terms of compliance against financial procedure rules or contract procedure rules to ensure there's sound financial management across the board, across all service areas, and that's just one category where we've given some advice, but it could be across a broad range of reasons why we've done that.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think we'll watch this space on that one.
Well, this is a limited opinion, so you'll be taking a second look at them, won't you? Just in a future path.
Yeah, we will be, and in the 6-month update report, which we will probably be bringing back to Audit Committee around June, there'll be more detail within that report as to why we determined it to be a limited opinion.
Thank you for that. Councillor Feekins.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andrew. Just on Appendix 3, for a number of special investigations, I see that the special investigations are less this year than they were last year. 2 questions, if I may. One is, what instigates a special investigation in a simplistic term, if we can? And then, what are the factors that are making us have less special investigations this year compared to last year?
Okay, thank you, Chairman. In terms of how they come across our table is in a number of ways. It could be as part of our audit work. So as part of our routine audit work, we would identify some concerns where we would need to step away from the run-of-the-mill routine audit work and undertake a special investigation. So if things are seriously non-compliant or we've identified a significant financial issue, then we would need to explore that further, and that would be deemed a special investigation. Also, we get allegations from other officers within the organisation, from senior management who may have some concerns that they want us to look at, or we get anonymous allegations coming through either to myself or to Peter, generally around financial irregularities. So our role is to either prove or disprove those allegations. So we have to do enough work to substantiate that allegation or not, and then report back. So we may then get involved in some disciplinary processes as a result. In terms of the numbers, that varies from year to year. There's no control over that. 1 year could be lean because nobody's reporting into me. Another year could be quite excessive because lots of people are reporting particular issues. And not all are substantiated. There's no evidence to prove the allegations in some cases. So it's a complete mix, but we've got no control over the numbers.
Councillor Smith.
How to ask what were the special investigations? What were the topics?
I haven't got that information to hand, but I can provide that an overview when we meet in March, if members will be happy. I can't go into detail because of various reasons, but I can give you an overview of the type of work we're looking into in terms of that respect.
I read these reports, by the time I get to the end, I've forgotten what was beginning. Looking at page 8, there's an awful lot of categories of 4, which means that sort of we're not doing terribly well, are we? Going down from P1920 09, we have the 7 areas that have not performed well, it seems. So what happens now?
Okay, so when we finalise those reports, some of those reports are currently in draft, which means we need to finalise those reports. The final reports then goes to their respective head of service, and then we will go back and do a second audit. So we'll do a follow-up audit within about 6 to 12 months of that final report. Hopefully, there will be signs of improvement, and we'll identify that through our testing. If we feel that significant improvements have not been made and it warrants a second consecutive unfavourable audit opinion, then we'll be bringing it back to Audit Committee within my 6-month report, putting the reasons why we felt it warranted a second unreasonable opinion, and then I would be advising the chair and members to call in the respective service manager and head of service to justify why improvements haven't been made following the second audit.
Because if I can, Chairman, coming back, within there again, you've got the passenger transport unit, which sort of over the years I've been aware of popping up, and I don't feel it's making very good progress within that department. There seems, in my recollections, time after time, this has been an area that has been an area of concern, and I would like to have thought that we could have improved on that area by now, Chairman.
Okay, I think that's a fair point, but we don't cover the same audits every year, so it's on a cyclical basis. So we wouldn't necessarily look at PTU every year. Where it's come up previously and come into audit committee, it's been non-compliance with our contract procedure rules.
It's been various different things.
Yeah, in different forms and different ways. So when we do carry out an audit, we identify what the key controls should be in place for that service to demonstrate sound financial management, and we test against that then. So any weaknesses we identify, they're reported on, but we also identify strengths in our reporting as well. So there is a balance. When we get a limited audit opinion, it means that the weaknesses outweigh the strengths. So we are looking at it, and that's part of the reason bringing it to you as an audit committee, is then if you're concerned about it, is to potentially challenge the service manager and the head of service on that basis.
Something's going on in the background.
Yes.
Two slightly unrelated points, just in response to Councillor Smith's questions. So first off, just to highlight and provide a level of comfort and reassurance, I guess, in part, around the passenger transport unit. So there is a very comprehensive, overarching piece of work being undertaken around the passenger transport unit that is being led by Francis O'Brien, Chief Officer, and Deb Hill-Howells, the Head of Service. There have, and it's correct to say, there have been a number of operational issues, some caught by internal audit reports, some being dealt with within the operations themselves, but that is being worked through at the moment. So rest assured, that is being prioritised, acted upon. It may be a case with Deb Hill-Howells attending, I think, the next meeting to respond to the matter of fuel cards. If that's something you want a verbal update in and around, I'm sure she'll be very happy to give that to you. The further point, just to sort of add and supplement to what Andrew's just highlighted earlier on, and in terms of what happens next in and around these limited audit opinions. So whilst there is good governance arrangements through audit committee in terms of the 6 monthly reports coming in from Andrew, officers being held to account, etc. So at a senior leadership team level and a directorate management team level, and funnily enough, myself and Andrew have been in discussion about it earlier today. I am already in discussion with SLT colleagues at the moment, and in terms of my observations around that very point, the number of limited audit opinions, and in fact the point that Andrew's made in terms of follow-up audits that are also getting limited audit opinions. So that we will be bringing a broad conversation together. In fact, next week around this, I need, from a Section 151 perspective, and Andrew in his role as Chief Internal Auditor, we want levels of comfort and reassurance at an operational level that action is being taken to address the recommendations that have been raised. And that is incumbent on us as chief officers and the leadership team, as it is DMTs, to be doing that. So hopefully that can provide an additional layer of comfort that action is being taken.
Will that report come back to this committee? Or
No, it's not a report.
the report Francis.
Sorry.
Chairman, may I? So the work that Francis is doing on PTU, well, the transport department, where will that eventually end up? That report?
Well, in one sense, that is an operational matter being dealt with, so there's no requirement or necessity for that to come back into audit committee. I guess audit committee's attention is centred around areas of risk that is brought through the internal audit reviews that are undertaken. So matters in a PTU sense, matters such as the point that Councillor Reeson raised earlier, and in terms of the further information that will be brought to the fore in time around PTU vehicle maintenance, matters concerning fuel cards, etc., the risks that have emanated and have been identified, they will come back into Audit Committee for discussion and comment.
Would your review be the business of any one of the other scrutiny committees?
So PTU falls under strong community select committee. Yeah, absolutely.
Councillor Easton first.
Thank you, Chair. I think my questions were expanded into further discussion, and you've also raised the matter of discussing this within the the management team. And I was going to ask the sort of same question about would this go to the Strong Communities Committee for scrutiny as opposed to a management function?
So my response to that is that as the review works its way through, there will be aspects of the operations that will undoubtedly be redesigned. And as those things are put in situ, I would naturally expect in a number of cases there will be probably member decisions required, either at Cabinet, probably at Cabinet, I would think. So to that end, with pre-decision scrutiny being at the forefront, I would expect Strong Communities to be looking, having oversight there, and as those things work through, and that will just be, as the review works its way through and the component parts of the review sort of are embedded, I guess, and decisions subsequently made and scrutinised.
As I said, watch this space.
Councillor Feekins.
Thank you, Chair. And it's just a small ask of Andrew, if I may. You said earlier that you'd come back and you'd let us know what the special investigations or the nature of the special investigations are. Is it possible just to see that in the same timeline as the 2 years, as in Appendix 3, just to see if we can see if there's any recurring nature of special investigations? Yeah. Only in a simple form, only to make it easier for us to see.
Yeah, that's fine, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Chief Internal Auditor. I'll move on then to the next item on the agenda, which is Treasury Policy and Strategy Report. And we did receive Annex D, because my copy still says Annex D to follow, but we did receive that. Now, the recommendations are that the Audit Committee considers and endorses the proposed Treasury Management and minimum revenue provision policy statement for 2020-2021 and the proposed Treasury and Management strategy for 2021, including the investment and borrowing strategies for onward circulation and approval by full Council. Also, that the Audit Committee continues to review the Council's Treasury activities on behalf of the Council by receiving the mid-year report and the year-end report. So I understand that Jonathan and Leslie are going to introduce this paper.
Good afternoon, everyone, Chair and members. The Treasury strategy that is presented here for 2021 is not largely different from the one that was tabled for 1920. So I'll just go through a few points and then I will ask for questions. The purpose of the Treasury strategy and the other policy documents is basically to control borrowing and investments in a way which reduces and manages any risks. This is done by compliance with the CIPFA and Treasury Code and the CIPFA's Prudential Code. There is one slight change. Most recently, WG guidance on local government investments has been revised, and this will be implemented in the 2021 year. The sort of fundamental behind this investment strategy is looking at commercial investments rather than traditional Treasury investments, and it asks authorities to evidence that they are taking great care before entering into these investments. They're not actually preventing us doing so. So the annex, which came later, it sort of describes in summary some of the things that we currently have done or currently are doing before undertaking commercial investments. So it's not actually any change, it's just it needs to be done openly. That's really, I think, all that it's looking to achieve. The monetary levels for investment are broadly the same in the 2021 strategy as 1920. It's about £2 million limits with most of our counterparties for normal investments. The durations with some counterparties do go down. The limit, the longest duration we're allowed to invest for sometimes does go down as economic factors sort of demand that we need to be slightly more cautious. I think that the most difficult area for Treasury is achieving a balance, for the authority, is achieving a balanced budget. And ironically, some of the initiatives that have been put in place, like the commercial investments, has meant that we have higher levels of borrowing now than we have had previously. The levels of borrowing investment are in Appendix B for you. Those were the figures as at December. So that's the right page. So we've currently, or as at December, we had 174 million of external borrowing and 21 million of Treasury investments. So we had a net debt position of 155 million. Broadly, we're continuing with the philosophy of having about 50% long-term and 50% short-term borrowing, although that does mean we have a little bit more risk of exposure to interest rate changes, because our Treasury advisors and other parties are not predicting rises in short-term interest rates to any great extent. We still believe this is monetarily the best thing for the authority. In Table 1 of the main report, which I think is Appendix 1, just find it again. Just to highlight there on the bottom, at the bottom of Table 1, there's a line on its own, which is anticipated gross borrowing. I've lost flicking it up now. So I've lost it now. Is it gone? I'm no good with a mouse. But on the bottom line there, that you can see that the gross borrowing levels are reasonably constant for the duration of the MTFP, from March 20 to the end of the MTFP. You'll also see at the top left-hand corner of Table 1 that the capital financing requirement, so that's the total of the unfinanced, the total of the outstanding debt that the authority has incurred since we started doing this type of borrowing, is a total of 186 million. So that's the borrowing we've taken out but not repaid. Taken out but not financed. And that's split between the general types of capital finance requirement and the commercial investments. So you can see there that the commercial investments are adding about 35 million to our capital financing requirement and therefore to our borrowing. And then if just below that table, in fact I think it's below the Table 2, there's a graph which you may have seen before, which is called the liability benchmark graph. And that's basically saying that if we take into account all the borrowing that's in the medium-term financial plan, and then about 3.5 million a year for every year after that, the red dotted line is the amount of external borrowing that we'll need to take out, that we'll need to hold, So, and the grey is the borrowing that we currently have. As it matures, it obviously goes down. So the gap between what we'll need and what we have is reducing, albeit over a very long period of time. That can all change if various committees, council and etc. Fund additional borrowing funded schemes. But I think that's perhaps about where I want to leave it. Any questions?
Yeah, I'll throw it open to questions and observations from the committee, please. Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, I just make one, and it's pleasing to note, and it's on 4.1, I think it is, that there's a considerable return on investments made of some, if I know, a 4%, I think it was.
Yeah,
which I
yeah.
thought that was really good considering where we are at the moment.
That is. Do you remember that, about 2 years ago we agreed that we would invest a small amount? It's actually £3 million in strategic pooled funds. So, and the raison d'être of entering those funds is that you will keep that money locked away for 3 to 5 years. It's not something you can do for a short term, sort of 3 months. But those funds have returned really what we expected. It has dipped a little bit, but it's, it is, as you say, it's very reasonable.
Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to add that we've still got 20-something million left on the 50 million for the investment committee, haven't we? And there's a few more schemes coming forward there, which may or may not come to fruition. But so we are likely to be borrowing a bit more in the relatively short term. I think we're due next meeting. In it, I was looking for the report on the effectiveness of the investments, but Peter Davis anticipated what I was going to say. So
yeah.
Could I just
Yes,
say,
Councillor.
Chairman, it's interesting the investment strategy that this council has adopted, over the past year or so, is being followed by other councils within the area.
yes, it's amazing how people can suddenly wake up to ideas when they can see they're working.
Okay, well, I have a question.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Can I just reply? The capital financing requirement figures that are in the medium-term financial plan do include that 20 million of borrowing. So that is budgeted and in these figures.
This might be a clarification of terminology. It just alarmed me a little bit when you were looking at the figures on the top left-hand corner of Table 1, and I think you used to use the terms "not financed." I mean, in that sense, is that just because you haven't yet entered into borrowing contracts that you anticipate that you will, or does it have a special meaning, not financed?
Sorry, I think that was the slip of my tongue a little bit there. We do when we carry out borrowing, we do determine the finance method at that point in time. So yes, they are financed. But it's not actually being paid for out of revenue. So we've taken out borrowing previously to the extent of £151 million, but that will only be paid for in the future by the minimum revenue provision that's allowed for in each year's budget.
So I think then when you use terms "not finance," then you probably meant not revenue, in the sense that we distinguish between revenue and capital.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Fickins.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Leslie. Just a point of clarity, really, I suppose, from my point of view, is that if our loans are amortising over the period, admittedly up to 2065, it's a long way away, but does that mean that our income stream for revenue will increase over that period of time or the converse of that graph, effectively, on page 13? So we'll be able to take more of that cash out to store up, to back up our reserves, to back up our expenditure.
Do you want to go or shall I go? Yeah.
The graph there that we're talking about, that would be if no further borrowing was taken out. So the realistic position going forward would be that we'd replace a lot of those loans as they mature, and to meet that gap between them. So the revenue budget then would just bear the cost of those loans over the period that they were due to be repaid.
Does that mean that our borrowing or our borrowing capacity in that context is going to suddenly balloon over the next few years, much more than what's shown on the graph?
It wouldn't balloon as such, but you would expect the grey portion of that graph to remain more constant in terms of trying to meet the, as Leslie pointed out, the red dotted line. Yeah.
Is table 1 relevant here in the bottom line? Is actually giving you the total amount of borrowing for each, it's not new borrowing, it's a sustained level of borrowing over up till 2024. Is that right?
Yes, Chair. If you go back to table 1, probably the relevant line would be the cumulative new external borrowing, so the second line from the bottom, which kind of represents what we'd need to meet going forward in terms of getting towards that red dotted line that we require.
So in effect, it's not tapering at all. It'll end up just pushing that line out to a cliff edge at 2100.
Yes, I'm not really sure whether the cumulative new external borrowing has confused me more or less than what I understood before. Just tell me again, that bottom line in this table, that for each of those financial years is the total amount of borrowing that you would have in that year from all sources.
Sorry, did you say on the table or on the graph?
On the table, on that last line on the table.
Right. The cumulative new external borrowing requirement. Sorry, I've tried to think of a way of describing that slightly more. But basically, at the moment, we have a certain amount of borrowing, and by the end of March 20, this was at the time of writing the report, we would need to have taken out another 56 million of borrowing. Most of that would have been short-term borrowing. If you look at the graph, on the left-hand side of the graph, the grey bit has a very high spike on the left-hand side, and that's because the short-term borrowing that we hold that expires over the next 3 to 6 months is basically the grey graph is the actual borrowing. The dotted red is what we need. So on the left-hand side, the grey borrowing touches the dotted red line. Then if you move about 1 year across to the right, all of the current short-term borrowing will have matured, so that all needs to be replaced. So that would bring the grey line back up another sort of 60 million. So you'd only have a very small gap then between the dotted line and the grey, and that would need to be filled with long-term borrowing. That we could fill with longer-term borrowing. So so when I talked earlier on about we currently having about half and half short and long-term borrowing, the long-term borrowing is the grey stuff at the bottom, and then the short-term borrowing above that is the white gap above that would be the short-term borrowing. So we're proposing to continue replacing the short-term borrowing sort of into the foreseeable future as far as we're forecasting. But all that borrowing, long and short term, is already built into the revenue MTFP and into the other figures in this report. So yes, on table 1, the cumulative new external borrowing requirement is saying that by March 20 we need to take out 56 million. By March 21 we need to take out 87 million, but that includes the 56. And then the following year 94, but that includes the 87. So it's cumulative. But because we've got this big chunk of short-term borrowing, that's always going to be needed to be replaced. So that always looks like a new borrowing requirement. So that element of it is a little bit is confusing. We could perhaps on the graph actually show in another colour maybe the intended replacement short-term borrowing, and then the grey line would be much closer to the red dotted line. Have I got anywhere nearer?
Councillor Feekins.
Thank you, Leslie. All makes perfect sense. Thank you. Out of interest then, historically, obviously the rates that we're borrowing at the moment, short-term and long-term lending, are more or less equivalent. Historically, has that always been the case within local government, or at some stages is it more prudent to take a bigger chunk of long-term borrowing and lesser short-term borrowing?
Testing my memory now, but I think probably I would say the last 6 to 7 years it's probably been that way, but historically it would have flipped the other way, so that we would have been in a different position, and we would traditionally have held very much longer term loans, and that's why if you looked into our loan portfolio, we still got a chunk of loans which were probably taken out over 50 years originally, and we're still holding them at that level.
All amortizing?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Are there any other comments or observations from the committee? Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I take the question to the appendix, a small appendix. You mentioned in the appendix from the Welsh Government guidance. I'm trying to find, I've lost it on my page. I'll get it. I got it. The Welsh Government guidance defines a loan as a written, or it's on page 2 of the little bit you sent us. The Welsh Government guidance defines a loan as a written or oral agreement where the authority temporarily transfers cash for a third party. Do we enter into any oral loans, and how financially prudent are they if we do?
No, we don't. Yeah. Yes. No. Yeah. That's correct.
Okay.
I would be a little bit concerned if we were entering into loan agreements on a verbal basis. Yes.
Okay, unless there are any other further observations, I will just record that we have acted on the recommendations. So, yeah. Okay. Any objections? No? Right. Thank you. The next item on the agenda, and thank you very much, Jonathan and Leslie. Next item on the agenda then is the whole authority strategic risk assessment paper. Now, this is going to be presented by Emma Davis, backed with Matthew Gatehouse. I'm hoping you can find somewhere to perch down here on the front.
This is Leslie and John's exit strategy.
I'll just give you a moment to get plugged in. Right, we're going to have a paper here, and the recommendations are members use the risk assessment to consider the effectiveness of the authority's risk management arrangements and the extent to which the strategic risks facing the authority are appropriately captured, and that members scrutinise on an ongoing basis the risk assessment and responsibility holders to ensure that the risk is being appropriately managed. So when you're ready, if you'd like to introduce your paper.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon all. As I'm sure you're aware, the Strategic Risk Register is it's a live document that is available for review and update throughout the year. That being said, we undertake a thorough review on an annual basis, firstly to provide members with an overview of the current strategic risks facing the authority, and secondly to provide yourselves as members with the necessary information to provide assurance on the adequacy of our risk management framework. So the Strategic Risk Register ensures that firstly risks are identified and monitored, that the controls in place are appropriate and proportionate, and that there's a systematic review of the risks being undertaken by senior managers and members. The information in the register is updated based on the latest evidence, which is available from a range of sources, and as such, some of the information contained in it will already be familiar to members as part of previous scrutiny, for example, internal or external audits that have been reported to you before. The risks contained within the register are only those regarded as high or medium level risks. Lower level risks and those that may impact at an operational level are detailed and also managed within the relevant business plans. But these risks can be added to the strategic register if it is anticipated that the levels will escalate within the 3-year period covered by the register. So this review has seen the addition of 2 new risks, one regarding the climate emergency strategy and the second recycling rates, and has also seen the removal of 1 risk regarding GDPR. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's leave it open to questions and observations on the paper from members of the committee, please. Councillor Smith.
Sorry, yes. Item 7 and item 6 in the actual, in your document, I've looked at those hard and I have a concern that have you given them the correct status? Because there are so many movable factors within those 2 items, one of which is the corporate parenting. There are so many uncontrollable factors in there. There are the financial factors, the demographics, the political situation. I really have a concern. They are uncontrollable. There are other items in here that are bread and butter things, really. You've identified, for example, recycling or meeting the targets as a risk. Yes, it is a risk. It's a financial risk. But these 2 that I have identified, 7 and 6, I consider are more than financial risks. Money is hugely important, obviously, in making the council work, but I have a concern that you said these are not worthy of that status. Children, adults, you have no control. We have no control. There's so many variables again, the numbers, the finance, demographics. So how do you actually assess the risk for those 2 items? Which I'll find, it's quite, hang on, that's why I'm having trouble. I haven't got my, I should.
Yeah, no, I absolutely understand it. I think it's a very good question, Councillor Smith, because clearly the lives of children and vulnerable people are one of the most important things that we as officers and you as members are responsible for.
That's what we're about.
And it's probably, we're sort of drawing attention to the different elements that make up that total risk score. So the risk level of medium as an overall score is made up of the likelihood and the consequences. So in all cases, the risks attached to corporate parenting and children in terms of the potential consequences are major. If we get it wrong, there is nothing more serious in terms of outcome than harm to vulnerable people. So that outcome is always at the higher end, it is always major, and I know my colleagues in social care would never countenance it being anything but in terms of that overall risk. The likelihood judgment, on the other hand, because of the systems we had in place and the relative infrequency of those worst outcomes happening, mean that the likelihood is assessed as possible. We don't anticipate in a 3-year period the very worst situations happening because of the safeguard systems and mitigating actions that we have in place. So what we use is a sort of grid that has those 2 things on, consequence and likelihood. Likelihood and impact. The impact is at the very top rating. The likelihood is lower, and that sort of balances out as a medium. But you are absolutely right in what you say. If we get that wrong, the risks are major and catastrophic in terms of what it means for people's lives.
Can I come back, Jim? Because in saying, if we get that wrong, we have no control. We have no control over those figures. Therefore, it must be a high risk, because it concerns the people we are here to serve. The whole reason for having a council is possibly the community and serving it properly. I honestly have a considerable concern that we don't have a control. And therefore, you've got the huge risk. We don't have the control. Because we don't have the control, gets out of control, we don't have the finance, and it's going to impact hugely in every other sphere. I don't make very good points, Chairman, but I read this and I've read it thorough. Well, I've gone through, and I can agree with your other readings and recommendations, but these two, I have a real big question mark in my mind. We've got a different political situation now as well that can impact hugely on how you care for people, how many arrive, whatever. So I would like members to sort of read, just glance at number 6 and number 7, those 2 points, and think, have we got the right rating? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Smith's absolutely right. We've got very little control over who comes into our care, whether they're adults or children. And you never know how much budget is associated with them. You can have one child cost you £250,000. But we do manage the risk, and we do mitigate it wherever we can. And we do build trends into the budget that helps us to cope with those pressures when they come along. So, yeah, the actual initial contact point is high risk, if you like, but we do try and measure that down as much as we possibly can. So I can understand why the officers class it as being medium risk, because of the level of anticipation which is built into the system. But at the sharp end, Councillor Smith's absolutely right.
Thank you for that. Councillor Feakins.
Thank you, Emma. Matt. 2 points, I suppose, for me. One would be, are we sure of our risks around energy and infrastructure? Moving forward, are going to be an electrified country. My understanding of the infrastructure at the moment is it's not in our gift, obviously, to buy or implement that energy infrastructure. But what is there at present will form the basis for any future development within our county. And given that we're heading towards a time when diesel and petrol cars will no longer be available, we'll be wholly reliant within a very short period of time on the energy infrastructure being in place. Have we got our eye on the ball about where that energy infrastructure is in place, and what are the drivers that we can use, or the levers that we can use to insist that the correct infrastructure is in place to support the county on a county-wide basis, as opposed to simple corridors within the county? That's one point I think that we need to have our eye on the ball for. And then the other one would be at 13, which is a newly added one. I'll just get to there very quickly. Which is to do with the global climate change. I think, for me personally, I think it's slightly more than just global climate change. I think it's climate change and environmental change. And environmental change will consider and include things like the coronavirus, which is happening, unrolling before our eyes almost. There are some significant changes, not just within the climate itself, but within the environmental aspect of the global climate. Sea levels rising, all the rest of it comes part of that. But that in itself creates a whole raft of issues regarding the environmental impacts for sewage treatment plants, and again, energy infrastructure again has got to come into play. So there's some big ticket items there, which I'm not saying necessarily we can cover them all off within our risk assessment, but I think we need to be aware of those. There's some real big ticket issues, big ticket items coming down the line towards us. which I think we have to have a consideration of that, because if we need to start using levers where we can to make those changes, then probably we need to start making those changes now.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, two really good questions, actually, and certainly in terms of the, to pick up the first point, for that's a really significant issue. And I was just sort of scrolling through, and I don't believe we've sort of captured that within this at present. I think in terms of the contracts for energy we have, our sort of security, our pricing is sort of relatively secure in the short to medium term. I think the point you make is absolutely right, that we're entering sort of globally a period of significant change in this area that probably stretches beyond the period of this risk assessment. But nonetheless, it's very important in terms of being in a position to be able to react to that, not actually react, to be able to plan for that changing global environment. But actually that is captured and reflected and is on the horizons of the relevant sort of departments. So, for example, I know in terms of energy and how we run our own energy supply, we've recently increased our capacity in that space. So we have an additional sort of energy officer coming in and working alongside our energy officer, Ian Hockham. To boost our capacity in that space. But I think it's a very good point. The 3-year nature of this risk assessment doesn't capture that. Just to make you aware, there's another piece of work happening in the context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It hasn't been before members yet, but it's something we would hope to bring to this committee before too long. We've been working with the other, actually across public service boards in Gwent, to develop a longer-term risk and opportunity register. So we were fortunate enough to pull in some money from Welsh Government to fund this, because it's the sort of expertise that we don't have, and doesn't naturally sit in local authorities. So we pulled in some funding through Sell to Wales, commissioned some consultants who are working across those PSBs, so all public bodies in Gwent, to develop that sort of different horizons and scenarios in these factors. And that's something we hope to bring back probably in sort of 4 to 5 months' time as the work develops. But I think actually the point you make absolutely vital, and hopefully some of that work will begin to answer those questions. The point around sort of climate and some of those broader issues, as you rightly point out, the risk around the climate emergency and decarbonisation is reflected here in the risk assessment for the first time. Members unanimously declared a climate emergency, and while we have to act rapidly on that, it still feels like we're in a quite early stage in terms of understanding some of the potential solutions and risks around that. But again, your sort of broader point around sort of globalization and things like sort of coronavirus and the speed with which sort of global pandemics can spread, where that tends to be reflected and where colleagues are working actively on that. It's reflected in here as sort of one line around business continuity, but sitting behind that, my colleagues in the emergency planning department carry out a whole wealth of planning and horizon scanning on these different issues. So sat behind what appeared to be quite a light line on business continuity is a wealth of information where all departments that are delivering crucial services and working with the public have sort of more detailed business continuity plans and plans in place to react to different situations. So, not sat too far from here at regular intervals, my colleague Ian Hardman that manages the emergency planning service is regularly sort of sweating as he looks at the rolling news forecasts and what it means for our services. So again, I'd recognise you don't necessarily see it here, but those plans are in place and sit underneath and within the context of this strategic risk register.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Smith,
sorry,
I think.
I have to smile. Climate change, we sit here with a couple of dozen lights blazing away every time.
Councillor Easton.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again, Chair. I'd like to ask you questions about the potential risk about organisational capacity. we're showing apparently the highest level, 11.5 days per full-time employee in Wales is higher than the average. That amounts, in my mind, to about £1.5 million, for sort of an average figure. You're showing a churn of close on 9% in staff leaving, but there's no indication of whether that 9% is exempt from people who are employing. What is the actual figure? And how does this 11.5 days per full-time employee actually affect the organisation of the authority? And equally, do you find that within the sickness, which people will be sick, how many people actually stay at home and work sick rather than come to work and be sick, or well, not come to work and not be sick? Have you got a complete balance on where we sit in terms of those on the sick, those working from home who are not very well, the churn of people leaving, and how the effect is on the whole of the workforce, which is about 3,000, isn't it? How that affects the rest of the workforce with this sort of level of sickness and churn?
Yeah, thanks very much, Councillor Easton. Good question. I think two factors there. Obviously, there's the turnover element of that, and just to sort of pick that one up first, because that's probably the easier of the 2 points. With any organisation, a degree of turnover is natural and actually desirable, because it means your good people are getting opportunities, they're moving on. Also, that means that new opportunities and new vacancies are created for young people, new ideas coming into the organisation. So there are always sort of questions, I think, in the HR profession as to what is an optimum level of turnover. I'm not sure anyone has sort of perfectly answered that question, because it differs by organisation and sector. But I think we'd recognise that a degree of turnover is healthy. In terms of those sickness levels, and the Chief Officer Peter may choose to come in on this as well, because it sits within his area. Clearly, there is an impact of having people not in work. There's a financial impact in terms of where those are frontline posts that need to be covered. So, for example, an absent home carer, we don't leave people without services. We bring in cover, bank staff, occasionally agency staff to cover those. So there will be a financial implication, but a minimal implication in terms of people in receipt of services, which is one of the key issues for us. In other areas, yes, if I were to be absent from my role, touch wood, that hasn't happened very often, but my work would sit there. We don't have anyone that comes in to cover the role of a head of service, because I would catch up when I return to work. And actually, it's judged on the basis of those different types of work as to whether a post needs to be immediately backfilled, and that's on a risk basis. But obviously, we're sort of continually working HR colleagues in terms of improving staff well-being. And your point, I think, around agile working, for a lot of colleagues, the advantage of agile working does mean that people are almost able to sort of self-isolate. So if people wake up, they have a cough and a cold, they're not feeling terribly well, their colleagues probably wouldn't want to be sat next to them coughing, spluttering and spreading their germs around the office. So we would expect that the ability of people to work away from their normal office base and sort of contain the germs at home, we would expect to have a sort of positive effect on impact. But I think, unless Peter would sort of come in with some more evidence, I don't believe we have any sort of statistical data that would confirm the impact of that. Anecdotally, as a head of service and as a manager, I know that sometimes people will give me a ring and say, I'm feeling a bit rough, I'm working at home today, but I'm still working. And we do have that anecdotally, but I couldn't point to a figure that would give you a clear idea of the scale of that.
I think it would be important to have some sort of idea of the flexibility of staff when they're not well.
Did you have something you wanted to add?
The amazing Matt Gatehouse, who seems to be able to dip into any area of the business and be able to provide a really in-depth analysis. So thanks for that, Matt, and you've probably covered off 95% of what I would have touched on in any event. I think just a couple points to add. possibly reinforcing points. First off, just in terms of staff turnover, coming back to Matt's point in terms of what the right level of staff turnover might be, and particularly in one particular part of the business, that's I guess a conversation we could have. But I think importantly, just in terms of change, and in fact pace of change, redesign of services, meeting the needs of our customers on an ongoing basis, turnover is healthy. Because what it does allow you to do, it's much easier within a service area that has a level of turnover to be actually able to adapt and actually move the service on and change the shape of it, and actually change the mix of skills and expertise that sits within that team. So and beyond all the points that Matt rightly touched on in terms of people securing opportunities elsewhere and in fact bringing new blood in. So yeah. In terms of the point around sickness, let's deal with the back end of piece of it first off. Just so Matt's absolutely right. We don't capture data in terms of people who are what we would describe unwell but working. However, it's probably not 50-50, but there is a dual responsibility here. There's a responsibility on the employee to determine when they are not well and to certify themselves as such. There is also a responsibility on the line manager, and that is a judgment. It's a judgment call to a point whereby if an individual is clearly unwell and is clearly showing signs of not being fit for work, then sometimes that's not always an easy conversation because it requires the individual's consent. But we don't hold that data. The only other point I would touch on really, which is, I guess, just sort of reinforcing Matt's points in terms of the efforts that, I guess, colleagues in people services, HR, training, efforts around well-being, and all of that that's taken place. And we do provide regular updates into strong communities around that. We clearly look to try and drive improvement in our sickness stats. On the one hand, we have seen, although it's plateaued of late, increases in the percentage of sickness that relates to stress and psychological reasons. And some of that is linked to, I guess, or some aspect of it is linked to just the challenges that we have internally in terms of capacity, the pressure on our workforce, our colleagues, our management. Matt's point around well-being is an important one, but there's probably an organisational reflection there as well, and in terms of understanding within the confines of our limited resources what we can and can't do. So that is it's an ongoing process. It works. That's something, as Phil knows, is part of the budget process, but it happens at many layers of the organisation where sometimes we've just got to say no, we've got to pull back, because we simply don't have the capacity to be able to deliver it. And and if we didn't choose to make such decisions, then you'd have a lot more people potentially going off sick because of the consequence. So hopefully some of that further insight is just useful.
So can I conclude really that 11.5 days per year could well be hiding a higher figure which we don't really know about and we haven't any analysis on.
Well, thank you for that. Councillor Smith.
It's relating to the same point because if you look at page 54 and page 55, when I was reading through, what struck me, there seemed to be a reluctance on the part of some managers to actually get those records proper. A recording module was developed that allowed managers to record the completed CCO directly into the HR systems, had varying degrees of success due to a number of factors, and then to enable managers to complete the review in a way that suits them and their team. All managers have been instructed to input the completed numbers into their quarterly business plans. So I read it, and on the other page it's perhaps a little difficult to fit into the work plans within departments and the appreciation that you do need to know these figures. Thank you.
Just very, very quickly, just two points in response. So number one, I think as touched on the action list, there is a report due to be coming in May, June time on this very matter. So hopefully we can provide you some additional level of comfort and reassurance at that point. And I guess the difficulties, I guess, that we've highlighted and that you've touched on there, Councillor Smith, in terms of recording, that doesn't necessarily translate into appraisals and assessments being undertaken in the business, because I know from my conversations with chief officers, with DMTs, that they are taking place. What I cannot precisely determine at the minute is to the level at which they are taking place, which is where hopefully I will be able to provide that comfort now in due course.
Right, if there are no more points or observations people wish to make or questions to ask, just record then that we have followed the recommendations that were made in the context of receiving this paper. So thank you very much for that. If I may then, I shall move on to the forward work plan, which has just been revised and repopulated. If anyone's not got the latest version, you can get a paper one from the desk down here at the front. There's a lot more on it, probably needs to be absorbed, but I'm just glad to see that we're now looking quite a long way ahead. So I think that is very useful, unless anyone's got anything they want to say or add about that. I'll move on again then, if I may. So the minutes of the previous meeting, does anybody have any comments to make, observations on the minutes? We've got someone to move that we accept them. Second from Councillor Eason. So we'll accept the minutes as a correct record. Thank you very much. And the date of the next meeting will be on the 19th of March. So thank you very much, everybody.